Hello and welcome to the Art of Being Human. We've been working with PTSD and other things that will cause you to have difficulty in your relationships, and I'm not quite finished with it yet. I thought I would be, but I've read more information just within the last 2 or 3 days, and I want to include it. So let me say, and before I start, I want to show you this book. I've had it in here before. This is the DSM-4. The DSM-4 catalogs, it's a huge volume, it catalogs mental illnesses, emotional issues and so forth. All the emotional issues that we know about common to mankind is in this book. They're all coded, they're all described. I'll just flip it open to you. Let me see, I think I may have the PTSD section right here. No, this is something else. Let me try this. Everything is coded. Any mental illness is described, cataloged, all the symptoms are given, the etiology is given. Everything that a person can know about illnesses, mental illnesses, is in this book. And it's a very good book. It's very thorough. It's very complete. All of the psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, we all use this book in terms of diagnosis. And everything is coded. Like, for example, PTSD, I think, is coded as 300.8. So if I were to see somebody that had PTSD and I wanted to send information to their insurance company, I wouldn't even write the diagnosis as post-traumatic stress. What I would do would be I would code that 308.03, and the insurance company would know what it was. And I have handed receipts out to people and that they've paid me, and I've given them receipts, and they'd say, what is this, and why don't you write out what the diagnosis is? And I'll tell them, if you should lose it and your name is on it, someone picks it up. If they know you, they know what your problem is. And in order for privacy, it's just better to code everything. And then if anyone finds it, whether they know you or not, and you've lost it, then they still don't know what you have. There's nothing that they can say because all they have is a group of numbers. And the insurance companies will know what that is. Excuse me, while I take a drink. Now, the information that I want to give you on PTSD is something that has just kind of come in. This book is being revised. DSM-4 will be revised to DSM-5. And they're in process of revising it. Every few years they revise it for the next issue. And the reason they do that is more information comes in, more medical treatments come in, and they want to accommodate all of the new information, so they revise the whole book. Now, what's being revised, I know, for DSM-4 is the PTSD diagnosis. That's being revised. Autism is being revised, and there are probably a number of other conditions that are also being revised. But the information I want to add to the PTSD is that, according to modern research, 15 to 20% of soldiers coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq have PTSD, and a lot of it is based on an extreme sense of shame and guilt. Now, why the shame and why the guilt? Well, it's the fact that sometimes when a person goes to war, there is an unintentional killing of innocent people. And it is the unintentional killing and maiming of innocent people that has caused the PTSD in a lot of soldiers that are coming back, a good 15 to 20% of them, according to the statistics. That has to be treated. Soldiers will come back and say, I'm a bad person now. I have lost my soul forever. The world is exceedingly dangerous. Now, these are direct quotes that soldiers have made when they have come back from wartime from Afghanistan and Iraq. That has to be treated because this is an immobilizing situation. If you feel that you are to blame for unintentional harm to innocent people, which is going to happen in wartime, then that can affect you so seriously as to be immobilizing. So that has to be treated. And some of the PTSD reactions that soldiers are getting are based primarily on that sense of guilt and shame. Guilt is when you feel that you're responsible for something. There's such a thing as true guilt, there's such a thing as false guilt. True guilt is when you really are to blame for something. False guilt is when you're blaming yourself for something that's not your fault, but you're taking the responsibility for it even though it's not your fault. And it's a trick to separate the two. If you're suffering from guilt, you have to sort out, what am I responsible for? What am I not responsible for? And these soldiers can't do it. When you're in the midst of a PTSD reaction, you can't figure that out for yourself. If you could, you might not have the PTSD reaction. Now, not everybody that comes back has this reaction, but a lot of people do, and it's becoming more prevalent as we become more involved in Middle Eastern situations. And so that has to be treated. And the DSM is now in the process of reformulating what PTSD is. Now, everything I've told you about PTSD is true. It's not that that's going to be changed. What's going to happen is they're going to be, other things are going to be included. And I should mention this too while I'm thinking about it. It's a little bit of an aside, but I want to mention it. If you have depression, that does not mean you have PTSD. If you have anxiety, phobias, other types of emotional problems, it doesn't mean that you have PTSD. But the PTSD reaction includes all of those things. So you could have any number of symptoms and they would fit under the umbrella of PTSD if you have PTSD. But it's certainly possible to have any of these symptoms and any of these conditions without having post-traumatic stress. It is an extreme stress problem that you have that causes the PTSD, usually done through trauma or abuse, either seeing it or experiencing it. And I have talked to you about that before. All of the things I have said are true and would continue to be included in a diagnostic manual such as the DSM. But what they want to do is add this other element that some people's PTSD is based primarily upon guilt. Now, shame is when you feel less of yourself. You feel that you're not worth anything. You feel that what you've done is so awful that now you have no worth. And when a soldier comes back from Afghanistan and says, "I've lost my soul forever," and that's a direct quote, that has to be treated. That borders on the shame. I am no longer worthy to be called a human being because I've done such despicable things, I have no worth. That can destroy a person. And in wartime, things like that happen. Innocent people do get hurt. Innocent people do get killed. And we don't want to see it. It's an awful thing. But on the other hand, if you are a combat soldier and you go into wartime, some things are bound to happen. It's just the nature of it. And you need to come back healthy, glad to be back, and recovering from any emotional wounds that you have. So it's the guilt and the shame that scientists have studied that cause a lot of people PTSD. Now I want to go on from here into school shootings, because we've had a lot of school shootings, and a lot of the students who see it or are a part of it in some way end up also with PTSD. You have to remember that when a school is in session, a child needs to feel safe. They cannot learn if they don't feel safe. Then you have a student or maybe a group of students going into the school and shooting other students. And they're going to get PTSD. The survivors are going to get PTSD. The people who have been shot are going to get PTSD because this is a life-threatening traumatic event. But why would a student go in and shoot their classmates? Why would a postal worker go into the post office and shoot people that they're working with? Well, the problem is that they feel so helpless that they're in a state of rage. Most students who go in to actually shoot other students in a school shooting, they're filled with rage. Now what happens, there's a cycle that happens, and I think if you understand the cycle, that you'll understand what the problem is with these students. If a student has been bullied, if a student has been picked on, if a student has tried to do the best that they can and they can't do it, they're picked on mercilessly. On the internet, they're called names. They just have a horrible time. What's going to happen to them? After a while, their mind kind of shuts down and they're filled with anger. But before they're filled with anger, they have a sense of helplessness. Any person, it can happen to one person, it can happen to a few people, it can happen to a whole group of people. If they feel they cannot make any changes in their life, if they've been picked on, if they've been blamed for things they haven't done, if they've been just wrongfully accused, if they've been there's name calling involved, whatever it is, and they cannot make a change, no matter how hard they try, what happens is they start feeling helpless. And according to Rollo May, a famous psychologist that lived years ago, anytime you get helplessness, that helplessness turns to rage. And that rage is acted out. And I think that's a true statement. I think that's a true idea that he had. If you start feeling helpless and you can't help yourself, then you become enraged because you can't make changes that you want to make. And if you can't make changes that you want to make, then you're going to get so angry about it that's going to turn to rage. We're not talking just a little anger. We're not talking about being ticked off. We're talking about absolute rage, and that rage gets expressed. If that rage gets expressed outwardly, then what you're going to have is violence, school shootings, murders, things like that. If it's a group of people, then you're going to have gang warfare. You're going to have gangs acting out against people who are not involved with gangs, and it's going to be miserable. If it's inwardly, you can have aggression outwardly, you can have aggression inwardly. Outward aggression results in violence. Inward aggression results in depression. There are a lot of people who are depressed because they're angry. And they can't show it. Supposing you're a woman and you're living in an abusive situation, or you're a child and you're living in an abusive situation, you cannot outwardly aggress, because that would put you in more danger. If you're already abused, you don't want to do something that's going to cause more abuse unless you totally lose control. If you totally lose control and you aggress, then what you're going to get are shootings, murders, and so forth, and that's what happens. If you can control it and you don't outwardly aggress, you can turn that anger and that helplessness inward. And if you turn that anger and helplessness inward, what you're going to get is a lot of serious, serious depression. And that's what happens in school shootings. Now, there was recently a school shooting where a boy went in and he shot at about 7 students. He killed 3 of them. And it was not a bullying situation. And the school officials and the police were eager to say this child was not bullied. As a matter of fact, when students were interviewed, they all said they were so surprised because they liked him. They thought he was a nice person. They didn't bully him. But what they didn't know, and what the police didn't know until later, is that his parents had been accused of violence against each other. There was a lot of violence in the home, and it was against the mother and the father against each other. And so what he saw at home was a lot of violence. Now, I've said before that PTSD happens when you either see abuse or trauma, you see it or you experience it. He was experiencing it in a sense by seeing it. And he was a quiet kid. So he was building up all of this helplessness, and it turned in to be aggression, outward aggression, not inward aggression, and he acted on it, and he shot the students. And he shot aimlessly. He wasn't aiming for any one particular student. It was just he went in and he shot. Whoever was there got it. And some people escaped and 3 didn't. So there's usually, when you have a child or somebody that's going to be outwardly aggressing, then you can be sure that there's been some violence in their past. or they've seen violence, or they've seen trauma, or they have experienced it. You can be sure of that, because that's what happens, and it's a tragedy. It's an absolute tragedy. But this particular boy was not bullied, but there was so much violence in his past, he acted out on it, and he did it against his schoolmates, even though they themselves weren't the bulliers. I have my own private ideas about bullying. It has to be stopped. It cannot be allowed to continue. When I was a school counselor, and I was for a while, a number of years, we used to have bullying in the schools, and we stopped it. I would take and work with a child, and I would have the teacher. I would always work with the teacher that had the bullying students in his class or her class. I would work with the teacher. We'd have a plan of action. I would take the child out of the class for a while, talk with them, get to know them, help them to express their feelings, while the teacher worked with the rest of the class in terms of their bullying behavior, letting them know it was inappropriate. They would not stand for it. And I understand that people who do bullying, and that's involved with the school shootings, of course. People who do bullying have many times been bullied themselves, and so they have their own issues to deal with, and they need treatment for that. But I think if it comes to the fact that you treat them and they do not get well and they still bully, it may be that the only thing you can do is pull them out of school for the sake of the other students. I know if I had a child that was being bullied, I would not allow them to go to school and put up with it, because it can be intense, it can be awful, and you got to realize that teenagers themselves, they're not sure about their identities yet. They're still developing their identities, and to have them put up with bullying makes them feel worthless, makes them feel full of shame, and they can't develop as they need to develop. So if I had a child that was being bullied, I would pull them out of school. They could go to school online, they could go to school by correspondence courses, they could be homeschooled. There's another way of getting an education, but if they're going to be bullied and they're going to be hurt to the point where some of them are going to want to kill themselves, and some of them do because they can't handle the bullying, I would take my child out of school. And as I took my child out of school, they would be educated in another way, and then I would go to the guidance counselors, and I would go to the principal, the superintendent, maybe the school board members, and I would try to work with them to devise a way to make it safe for students to go to school without putting up with that. I wouldn't allow my child to go through that. I don't think it's worth it for the child. And it wouldn't be worth it for me as a parent either. Now, it takes a lot to bend me out of shape, but if I had a child and the child was being picked on, I'm afraid I'd become a mother bear, and I would be fiercely defensive of my child. So it's a problem that has to be dealt with. So PTSD, school shootings, bullying, all of that is tied in together. So I'm going to close it off here, and we'll deal with dissociative reactions, which I intended to do today, and next week we'll do them. So please watch me then, and have a great day.